I have come to understand that not everybody understands what I mean by the problem of the testing for the coronavirus and the accuracy of the test. And this got particularly driven home to me because I'm part of a number of physicians groups who are interested in these issues. And recently a physician sent me an email, not specifically to me, but to the group, saying she has run upon a test for the coronavirus that she knows is 84.6% accurate, and it could have been 86.4. The important point was it was 84.6 or some number in the 80s point something percent accurate. And then I received another email from another doctor saying he had a test that was 100% accurate. And they were telling us this because they said, if you want to get a hold of this test, you could go to this place and we could order the test so we could presumably use them with our patients. Now, of course, my first response to the 84.6 offer was, I would only want to do a test if it was 84.7% accurate. 84.6, not good enough. But the interesting thing about that offer is it actually explains the entire problem of the testing. And let me try to go over this once more because I realize how complex it is, and this is so key to understanding this whole situation. So as I said, virologists, infectious disease people, immunologists, etc., internists, anybody involved in this, has agreed for the last 100 years that there's a certain strategy that we use for understanding whether a disease has an infectious etiology or not. And those agreements are called Koch's postulates. Now, I do know that Koch's postulates have some issues, but that's way too complicated to get into right now. Basically, everybody agrees that that's how we prove infectious disease, and they go essentially like this. Number one, everybody has the same or very similar symptoms. Number two, if you test all those people with symptoms, 100% have the organism that you're looking for. Number three, if you take 100 normal people, none of whom have those symptoms, then none of them have that organism that you're looking for. And number four, if you take that organism from the sick people and purify it so that you have nothing else in there but that particular organism, and you inject that into another person, which you wouldn't want to do, but into an animal, then they will become sick with the same disease, and they will have the organism in them, and then you can keep it going. And so an example of that would be strep throat. Almost everybody who has strep throat has a sore throat, they have a fever, they have swollen glands, more or less the same symptoms with everybody. Now, if you take those people, 100% of them will grow strep in a throat culture, not any other organism, only strep. And then if you take 100 normal people, none of them have strep growing in their throat. And then if you purify the strep and you inject it into an animal or expose it to an animal, they will also get sick. The animal has to be susceptible. And then you've proven that strep is the cause of this person's sore throat. Now, again, I understand that there is more to it than this. And someday I will get into the more to it part of this, but that's not germane to this situation. The same thing works for viral infections, and I gave the example of chickenpox. Everybody has more or less the same symptoms. All of them have millions of copies of this virus in their blood. None of the people who don't have the chickenpox symptoms have the virus. And if you purify it, meaning you only have that virus, you expose an animal that's susceptible, they will get sick with whatever their version of chickenpox is. Now, that technique, those postulates, that way of seeing the world is how we prove infectious etiology. And I would say, period. And for the people who say we don't use Koch's postulates anymore, that is actually true. But the reason for that, it's partly true, because there are papers now about the coronavirus that say they are attempting to prove Koch's postulates. So it hasn't been totally abandoned. But my point of it was, this started with the whole polio thing, where they couldn't prove Koch's postulates. And so they came to a fork in the road, and they said they had one of two choices: either abandon that polio was caused by a virus, or discard the rules for how we prove infectious etiology. And unfortunately, in my opinion, for humanity, they decided to discard the rules, and then it was off to the races. Now, again, this test is called a gold standard. Once you have a gold standard test, then you can do a surrogate test, which is what the PCR or RT-PCR test is, which is the test they're using to say that people have an infection with coronavirus. And the way this works is they basically isolate or take a purified virus. They try to find out a unique part of the RNA in this case, and they essentially amplify it. And so then they say, if we can find this unique piece of DNA, that proves that the symptoms, the disease was caused by the coronavirus. But as I've said over and over again, the founder of this test said, you can only do this once you have a gold standard for proving that virus fulfills Koch's postulates. Because here's what happens. So you have people with strep throat, and you prove that their symptoms are strep throat. Then you could take a unique piece of the strep, do this PCR test, and then you could take 100 people with strep throat, and you could do the PCR test, and you would find something like 96, 97, 98 of the 100 have a positive PCR test at the number of cycles that you went through. That tells you that the false negative test is 3 or 4%. So then you know the false negative rate. And then you take 100 people who have no symptoms, and they have a negative strep culture, so you know they don't have strep. And then you do the PCR test at a number of amplification cycles, and you find, as happens with all biological tests, as happens with all PCR tests, that say 2 or 3 or 4 or 10 or whatever the number is, are positive. That's your false positive rate. The problem here is nobody did the Koch's postulates part. Nobody did 100 or 500 people who have symptoms, have purified coronavirus from them, shown that the coronavirus is not in the normal people, and then put it through an animal and prove sickness. Therefore, you have no idea, and I can't emphasize this enough, you have no idea what the false positive or false negative rate is. So all these numbers are completely bogus. So you could say, well, Tom, how do you know that? Well, I know it because when they publish this, they say that, and they'll say, for instance, we proved Koch's postulates, showing that they still believe in Koch's postulates, because here's what we did. We took some snot from somebody who was sick, we incubated that in lung cancer cells, then it produced all these particles, which, as I will talk about in a minute, we know that lung cancer cells, because they're poisoned, they produce these exosomes, which are actually identical to the virus. That's what Andy has proved in his talks. So then they purify the virus, they take some of the RNA, they try to make an animal sick. In this case, it was a mouse, but it turns out they couldn't make normal mice sick with this purified virus. So they had to use genetically altered mice who are susceptible and essentially immunocompromised, and only then could they make them sick. So that proves nothing, folks. You cannot do, That's not how you prove infectious etiology. All that proves is that if you incubate snot with lung cancer, you'll get a whole lot of debris, some of which has some RNA segments which will light up on an amplified PCR test. Now, the interesting thing about this is, so if we go back to this doctor offering me this test that was 84.6 or 86.4% accurate, it's obvious that if you say something is 84.6, that means you must have done 1,000 people and you must have purified the virus, these whole Koch's postulates, on 1,000 people. So that's your gold standard. And then you can do the PCR test and find out that it's only negative or only positive in, you have to do both. You have to show the people who are sick, and you get certain people don't light up, that's your false negative. And if certain normal people, certain number of people light up, that's your false positive. But because they never did the first, they never did the gold standard, not only didn't they do it on 1,000 people, because if they only did it on 10 people, then the best you could say is it's 10% or 20%. If they did it on 100 people, the best you could say is it's 93 or 94% accurate. But to say the statement that it's 84.6 means that you must have done this comparison to the gold standard with 1,000 people, which is simply ridiculous. There is no science in this at all. Now, people then who could ask me, well, how come they do this? And all I can say is I am determined not to get into motives of other people or economics or politics. But all I can say is this is exactly the situation with vaccine issues and vaccine research. And here's what I mean by that. Every drug, every medical device that we use, we have a very particular way of finding out how much toxicity, how much side effects there is to this drug or device. What we do is we take 1,000 people or 10,000 or however many people, and we give one set the drug, and then we give a match set of 1,000 people or whatever the number, matched as closely as possible, and we give them an inert placebo, and then we run the trial for as long as it would take to see if any side effects show up, any negative consequences show up. It could be a month, it could be 30 years. Because if you're doing a vaccine that you give at birth, whose side effect is ADD or ADHD, or at least you're worried about that, you may have to wait for 7 years before you know. So that's how we test medicines. That's how we test devices. Everybody agrees on that. Except with vaccines, they don't do that. They do a new vaccine, and they test it against a different vaccine. And for those of you who want the facts on this, I would go to the ICANN document where they documented exactly which vaccine. So I'm just going to make up, because I don't remember which vaccine they tested against which one. So these are not accurate examples, but they show the point. So you test chickenpox against the Hep B vaccine. And then you say, how can you test it against Hep B? And they say, well, we know that Hep B doesn't have any side effects, has no toxicity, therefore we can use it as the control. And then you say, well, how do you know that? Well, because we tested the Hep B against the placebo. What was the placebo? That was the MMR vaccine. So how do you know that the MMR vaccine is safe? Because we tested it against the placebo. So what was the placebo? The placebo was the DPT vaccine. And so that we know is safe. So what was the placebo with the DPT? That was the chickenpox, which all we're asking is do proper studies, don't do this circular argument. And that's exactly what's happening with the PCR test. They tested against another PCR test. That wasn't tested against the gold standard, so you have no idea how accurate or specific that was. And then you keep going, and then everybody forgets that the original one was tested against another PCR test. And then you basically have propaganda, not science. That's the problem here.